This is What If Jesus Never Lived, and it's part 2 of a 2-part series. It was based upon 2 books, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born and Who Is This Man, plus my own individual research. Jesus and the Education for All People. The historical impact of Jesus' teaching are so pervasive, it's often taken for granted. The record of his life and teachings of the Gospels has impacted the world so much, they have been translated into 2,500 languages. The Bible is the best-selling book of all times. Jesus began to teach anyone who would listen, and whatever you think of the answers he gave, the education of the world began to change. The followers of Jesus took the final command of go and make disciples of all nations by teaching them very seriously. They began a process of education. In the Greco-Roman world, education was reserved for male children of wealthy families. Jesus teaching his followers to love God with all your heart and your mind meant education for all people. Monasteries became places of great learning, and they preserved non-Christian books written on math, logic, and the arts. From monasteries came universities. The very first university was established in Paris around the 12th century, and Oxford and Cambridge came next. The motto of Oxford is from Psalms 27:1, "The Lord is my light." Then came universities in Rome and Naples, Vienna, Heidelberg. These were all begun by followers of Jesus, so people could love God with all their mind. In 1559, Calvin founded the Geneva Academy, which would become the first Protestant university in the world. And he stressed the education was for all people. Education changed when Martin Luther emphasized from the New Testament the priesthood of all believers. Every person needs to read and write so that they can study the scriptures for themselves. In America, within 6 years of the landing of the Pilgrims, they established the first university in order to know God, which was Harvard in 1636. The university, Harvard University, was named after John Harvard, a pastor who donated not only books but half of his estate to train ministers. The first law to require mass education was declared in Massachusetts in 647, so this was the mass education law, the old Deluder Satan Act. It was thought that Satan kept people from the knowledge of the scriptures, and a vision that everyone should learn was born. Then educators began Yale and William and Mary and Princeton and Brown, and with the same founding purpose. 92% of the first 138 colleges and universities founded in America were begun by followers of this man known as Jesus. In Texas, I went to TCU. We played Southern Methodist University and Baylor, which was founded by the Baptists. Even USC, University of Southern California, was founded by Christians in 1880 and was affiliated with the Methodist Church for 72 years until 1952 when it severed its ties. In 1780, Robert Raikes, a Christian in England, saw the cycle of poverty of ignorance by children working 6 days a week in factories. So he started a free school to meet on their only day off on Sunday to teach them to read and write. It was called Sunday School. Within 50 years, there were 1.5 million children being taught by 160,000 volunteer teachers who shared in his vision. Sunday school was not a program for church kids, but one of the great educational volunteer triumphs of the world. In the 1900, the population literacy rate in the world in non-Christian nations was only 5 to 20% that were literate. And Catholic nations, it was a little better. It was 40 to 60%. And prior to 1962, with the Vatican II decree, Catholics had little exposure to the Word of God. But in Christian nations of largely Protestant influence, and the literacy rate was 90 to 98% that could read and write. One of the other major achievements of Christian followers was the scientific advancement. Modern science began when the Aristotle view of the universe was questioned. And the Aristotle view for 1,500 years was that the earth was the center of the universe. It was questioned by Copernicus and Galileo. And Galileo at his trial said the Bible cannot be in error, but those who interpret it can be. Christianity provided important presuppositions of science that were not found prior to this. And that is, the Bible taught nature is real. It's not an illusion. Nature has value and is good to work with. It is not something to be worshipped, and it is not filled with spirits or gods that can be angered. Nature was created by God in an orderly fashion that has orderly laws which can be understood and can be trusted not to change. Science was justified as also a means of alleviating toil and suffering. If you look at the fathers of various branches of science, they were all strongly devoted Christians. Joseph Lister, antiseptic, where we get Listerine. Louis Pasteur, bacteriology. Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle. All of these individuals are the fathers of these branches of science because of their research and impact. Isaac Newton wrote more about the Bible than he did science. He wrote about Revelation and prophecies. And in 1704, he wrote a manuscript in which he attempts to extract scientific information from the Bible. The list goes on. Gregory Mendel, genetics. Blaise Pascal, hydrostatics. Lord Kelvin, we hear about Kelvin as the measure of heat. John Ray, natural history. In fact, some of his works are the wisdom of God, works of his creation. And Mathew Maury, the oceanographer, got the idea of the currents of the ocean from Psalm 8:8, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea that swim the paths of the sea. So he began to search for ocean currents, and this Psalm 8:8 is on his tombstone. The Bible reveals over 100 scientific claims written centuries before they were discovered. In the 19th century, we discovered that all visible matter consists of invisible elements, the atom. 2,000 years ago, the Bible in Hebrews stated, "So what is seen was made out of what was not made out of what is visible." The ancient belief at one time 2,000 years ago is that the earth was supported by some foundation. They had no idea it was free-floating in space. There was the Atlas, there was the turtle. The point is, when the Bible was written and these beliefs and superstitions were dominant, the Bible did not include them. In fact, Job, written 1500 BC, says he, referring to God, suspends the earth over nothing. The ideal dimension that we know today of modern shipbuilder for the ocean is, for stability, is the length to be 6 to 7 times the width. And the freedom of the seas is 7 times the length of the width, largest ship built to date. 4,500 years ago, God told Noah to build the ark at a ratio of 6 to 1, 450 feet by 75 feet wide. 2000 BC to 100 AD, the superstitious belief, the scientific consensus is the earth was flat. They had pretty much figured out it wasn't flat by 100 AD. So when Columbus was sailing, that's a myth. It was just he was going into uncharted areas. But nevertheless, in 700 BC, when this thought was rampant, Isaiah wrote, "He, God, sits enthroned above the circle of the earth." And the Hebrew word for circle means spherical. And prior to 1960, the consensus was the universe was eternal, had been there forever. But based upon evidence and also the launch of the Hubble telescope, the consensus now is that the universe did in fact have a beginning. At one time it did not exist, and it came into existence. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And Hebrews 1, on both of these are written over 2,000 years ago, is that the foundations of the earth and the heavens were in the beginning. The founding of America. The Mayflower ship, the landing at Plymouth in 1620, is the oldest continuously inhabited British settlement. If you go on Google and you see this revision of history, America, not a Christian nation. The founding fathers rarely practiced Christian orthodoxy. They were not, were not Christians. Our founding fathers at the very bottom were not Christians. This is an attempt to just revise the history of our country. The founding fathers is a specific group of men, 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Their membership was a matter of public record. 51 out of the 55 were Christians, 3 were deists, 1 was unknown. 28 were Episcopalians, and the list goes on. That's a matter of public record. The first Bible printed in English in 1782 was printed by the U.S. Congress for use in our public schools. In 1800, the U.S. Capitol was used for Sunday worship services in which President Thomas Jefferson attended. Jefferson had the Marine Band to play and committed federal funds to evangelize the Indians. By 1857, the U.S. Capitol was the largest church in America with 2,000 regular attendees. It was a megachurch. The core issue in the Declaration of Independence is that our rights come from God, not the British Crown. Our values are in the Declaration of Independence. Why did we declare? What was this based on? The opening paragraph says it all. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for people to dissolve their political bands which connected them, why did they dissolve this political bands? It was to which the law of nature and of nature's God entitled them. So they believed that they had rights from God that entitled them, and it's on those bases that they would separate from England. Now, the laws of nature and nature's God was not a new phraseology. It was used to describe God and his law. Sir Edwin Coke, English Chief Justice in 1613, 150 years earlier, the law of nature is that which God at the time of creation of nature of man infused into his heart for his preservation and direction. The moral law, also called the law of nature. Commentaries on the Law, 1758, by Sir William Blackstone. It's been used for over 150 years in our courts. The laws of nature, as man depends absolutely upon his Maker for everything, it is necessary that for all points he conforms to his Maker's will. The will of his Maker, the will of God, is called the laws of nature. The laws of nature's God, therefore, it has placed divine providence to discover and enforce its laws by immediate and direct revelation, and these laws are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures, in other words, the Bible. John Gray, a law professor in 1909, and this is still used in law schools today, refer to the law, particularly the constitutional law, as a living thing with a continuous history, sloughing off the old and taking on the new. So as culture changed, he, as controversially saying the law should change. So we have a situation where the state redefines a person rather than God. In 1858, the Virginia Supreme Court said, in the eyes of the law, the slave is not a person. In 1881, an Indian is not a person within the meaning of the Constitution, American Law Review. In 1909, according to the British Voting Rights Act, the statutory word person did not, in these circumstances, include women. In 1936, the German Supreme Court decision refused to recognize Jews as persons in the legal sense. This should be 1979. Human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist. They are not persons. Peter Singer, who is a professor, in his book, Practical Ethics. In 1997, the law of Canada does not recognize the unborn child as a legal person possessing rights. However, when is an eagle an eagle? It's an eagle when it's an egg. According to the Endangered Species Act, any bald eagle, known as the American eagle, alive or dead, or any part of the nest or egg thereof, shall be fined for $5,000 or in prison. Now, the unknown story of the abolition of slavery had its foundation in Christianity. The Roman Empire was 50% slaves. The population of Athens was 75% slaves. So war and conquest produced many slaves in the ancient world. Glenn Sunshine, historian, wrote, Christians were the first people in history to oppose slavery systematically. 2/3 of the members of the American Abolition Society in 1835 were Christian ministers. The early founders of that society, William Garrison, he joined the cause after reading an 1826 book by a Reverend, John Rankin. Arthur Tappan was a devout Calvinist, also founded Anti-Slavery Society and Missionary Association. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave, preacher, speaker, and author. And Theodore Weld left the seminary to be a pastor to join the society. The first abolitionist was Gregory of Nyssa. In 379 A.D., he was a church father. He criticized slavery and scolded Christians who owned slaves. He cited teaching of Jesus about the worth of every soul. The Arab Muslims were the major slave traders from 650 A.D. until 1900, in which it's estimated they captured over 14.4 million people. 27 million people today are in slavery. And in Sudan, there are mostly Christian women and children captured by the Muslims. Modern slavery today still represents 1 to 4% of our population, with the colors in dark being at the higher end of that percentage. In 1688, there was the Germantown Quaker petition against slavery. And this was the first petition made against slavery in the English colonies, done by Francis Pastoris, who was a very strong Quaker faith. And William Wilberforce in England was credited with ending slavery in 1833 for the British Empire. And the British Empire in 1833 extended well beyond the borders of England. In 1785, he had a conversion experience and became a Christian. He spent the following 26 years campaigning for the passage of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which prohibited the slave trade, the capture, and then the abolition of it, ending it, was in 1833, a good 30-some years before America did. Elijah Lovejoy was the American first martyr in the freedom of the press. He was a Presbyterian minister. He published newspapers in St. Louis where he advocated abolishing slavery. Mobs continually destroyed his press. He moved to Illinois and continued publishing anti-slavery articles. And a mob in Illinois then destroyed his press again in July 1837. He rebuilt, but in November of 1987, the mob set fire to the building, and Lovejoy was shot and killed while fighting the fire. Since 1952, the Lovejoy Award is given annually to journalists who exhibit courage in the freedom of the press. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a strong Christian. She married a professor at a school to train Presbyterian ministers. She supported the Underground Railroad. And in 1851 wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this book had a major emotional impact against slavery. Charles Torrey was a Massachusetts minister, one of the founders of the Underground Railroad. He was arrested for aiding slaves to escape and died in prison at the age of 33. And there's one of his articles there. George Cheever was a minister of a Congregational Church in Massachusetts, and he authored God Against Slavery in 1857. And one of the best-known ministers in the United States, spent 50 years as a pastor and leader in the anti-slavery movement, William Furness, wrote many articles against slavery and preached about it. And finally, we come to old-fashioned marriage. And this was where a man leaves his parents, becomes one, what God joined together, let no man separate. Mathew 19 in the Gospels. In the ancient world, marriage was the primary loyalty was to parents. And there was a double standard for men. The Roman law protected men's sexual adventure outside marriage. And in the Greek and Roman culture, it wasn't uncommon for adult men to have young boys to have sex. Slave girls were also used. When Christianity left its impact on marriage, the primary loyalty was to each other, and the husband and wife were one flesh and were to be faithful to one another. In the ancient world, marriage was political and economic. Brothers often married sisters to keep property in the family. Roman weddings were unstructured and had many non-marital sexual arrangements. In Christianity, it changed marriage to not just an economic or social institution. It is a God-directed covenant. Before God, they make a vow, they promise, they give their word for better or worse. Two people, two set of desires are joined together in the unity of a loving commitment to one another. In the ancient world, thou shalt not commit adultery was only heard by the Jews in Israel. In Christianity, thou shalt not commit adultery was heard everywhere the Christian community spread. Jesus warned about lusting as well, and the core issue wasn't attraction or just behavior, it was to have a good heart. The concept of hypocrisy. People sometimes reject the church, the Christian church, due to their claim of hypocrites in it. Well, they need to stand in line behind Jesus. Matthew 23, woe to scribes and Pharisees. Jesus uses the term hypocrite over 17 times. The Greek word for hypocrite refers to an actor who wears a mask and plays many roles. Jesus was introducing a new concept. What mattered wasn't what people thought of you on the outside. The God of the Christian Bible was able to look deep into your heart. You might fool others, but you can't fool God. The word hypocrite is found only once in the Old Testament, and it means a person of low morals. Jesus, when he referred to hypocrites, wasn't talking about believers. The target of his words were evil people pretending to do good. Examples he gave were repressing the poor and widows, deceiving people from knowing God, doing everything for show. The target of Jesus' words were not believers who sin on occasion, who are under construction, we're all sinners, but someone who practices those sins on a routine basis. And finally, if Jesus had not been born, there would not have been the crucifixion, and there would not have been the resurrection. Now, some people say that Jesus was just a man and did not resurrect from the grave, and that is another presentation. But his followers who were afraid at his crucifixion all became martyrs. And people will die for what they believe is true, but they won't die for something that is not false. Acts 40 records that Jesus appeared to many people in the 40 days before he ascended. Christianity spread from these earliest people to all parts of the world. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, and if you want to learn more about this particular subject, Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ gets into the historical evidence of that subject. Thank you.